Well, everyone, hello. Good evening or good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are, and welcome to this CSCW 2022 panel on consent, a research and design lens for human-computer interaction. And I also see things in the chat, or not really, so Jane will handle that. Now, before we get into the actual topic of this panel, which is consent, I want to take a second to talk about what a panel even is, because it's a little bit different from your typical paper presentation. I remember when I first attended a panel as a PhD student some years ago, it was at CSCW. Actually, I was quite confused. There was a presenter on stage presenting their research. And in the middle of it, an audience member got up and started talking at the same time. And I thought, how rude to interrupt a presenter. And of course, what I didn't realize at the time is that is what a panel is about. A panel is just a fancy word for a conversation between the panelists who are researchers and practitioners who are doing work related to the panel topic, but also a conversation with the audience, with you. And we are encouraging you to actively engage with this panel in three different ways. One, you can use the Q&A feature in Zoom with the caveat that anything that you send through the Q&A interface will be seen only by us panelists. We also have a channel in the CSCW Discord. It's called Consent. You can see it if you're having trouble finding it. It's at the bottom of the list of channels in a category called panels. Now, anything that you post in that Discord channel can be seen by all attendees of CSCW this year, and those messages will remain there after our panel is over. So this would be a really effective way to share any kind of reading recommendations or prolong a conversation after the panel is over. That's all well and good. I'll probably be leaving some notes there as well about things we've discussed in the panel today. And then lastly, if something strikes you in the hours or days or after the conference and after the panel is over, you're welcome to email us panel organizers. You can find us in the extended abstract for our panel that was published in the ACM Digital Library. That's linked in the CSCW program. And I've also just posted a link in the consent channel on Discord. So this is how today's panel is going to be structured. First, our panelists will briefly introduce themselves, and I'm hoping we can get a few audience members maybe introducing themselves as well through text, either through the Q&A or through the Discord channel. From there, my co-organizer Jane Im will be introducing our panel's topic of consent. And then a bulk of our time is going to be dedicated to discussion. And the way that that will be structured is that each panelist will introduce some of their work related to this panel's topic of consent, and they'll use that to offer up a topic, a question, a provocation for discussion amongst the other panelists and the audience. And each of those provocation discussions will keep going for about 10 to 15 minutes or until the conversation exhausts itself. And then we'll move on to the next panelists and their respective provocation. Now, speaking of the panelists, let's get into some introductions. Since I'm already talking, I guess I'll go first. My name is Douglas Zitko. I'm an assistant professor at Oakland University, and my research intersecting with consent is mostly in the context of online dating. I've studied how users of the dating app Tinder give and receive consent to sex, and the CSCW community seemed to like that work. It won a Best Paper Award and an impact recognition last year. Jane, I'll hand it off to you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jane. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Michigan. So I'm mainly interested in feminist perspectives on consent, and especially using them as a design lens for building safer social platforms. And Jonathan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jonathan. I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at MIT with the Visualization Group and also a frequent collaborator of the Citizens and Technology Lab at Cornell. And my research mainly thinks about research ethics and ways to design software to manage ethics procedures at large scales for social media research.
Hi, I'm Alyssa Redmiles. I'm a faculty member at the Max Planck Institute for Software Systems and also a visiting scholar at Harvard's Berkman Klein Center. And a lot of my work looks at safety for marginalized groups. So that might be sex working populations, folks engaged in other kinds of online, offline interactions like online daters or care workers, and trying to understand how we can build technology to be safer for those folks.
Hi, I'm Amy Hasanoff. I'm at the University of Colorado, Denver, and I'm associate professor in communication, and I study gender, sexuality, and online harm.
Hi, I'm Tomomi Tanaka. I'm an international director of international safety at Match Group. And I'm trained as a behavioral economist. So I'm going to bring in more behavioral perspectives on consent.
Jane, do you want to continue? I can let you share your screen now. While Jane is loading up her slides, I just want to give a shout out to the activity in the Discord channel. Thank you, Charlotte, Amy, and Naomi for their comments about our unintentional casual start to the panel.
Okay, yeah, so I'll briefly introduce the panel's topic, which is exploring how can we use consent as a research and design lens in HCI, CSW, and adjacent fields. But I think some of the folks in the audience might be wondering why consent. So the reason is that consent, which we roughly know as agreeing to something, is deeply related to how individuals navigate with others, interactions with others, and also with technologies. So to give some examples, people constantly communicate consent in interpersonal interactions involving various social cues, such as in sexual interactions. And in consumer to company contexts, companies are legally required to obtain users' consent when collecting personal data. And another example is governance. A community's governance is inseparable from whether or how it obtains consent of its community members. And so thinking about consent on an individual, community, or organization level is helpful when thinking through social technical problems as well as research methods. At the same time, there exist many definitions of and viewpoints on consent, mainly due to the complex and messy real-world context. So for example, in many situations, people have difficulty explicitly consenting, such as unconscious patients. So in this panel, we aim to explore different definitions and types of consent along with limitations. So to summarize, the goals are to introduce and spark opportunities for consent as a novel research and design lens, and also to instigate cross-field collaboration around consent in different fields. And with that, I'll hand it over to Alyssa.
Thank you, Jane. Yeah, so today I would like to kind of pose two primary provocations, which come from thinking about concepts of consent and data privacy in kind of two different directions. So I'd like to talk about some ideas around making consent kind of positivist, and then also some ideas around context relativity, and I'll describe what I mean by both of those. So in the space of data privacy, consent often focuses on what won't happen to our data, right? So we might say, oh, I am going to fill out this kind of notice and consent form, right? The privacy policies that we're all used to, or other kind of disclosures. And it'll talk about, how they're going to protect my data from being leaked, maybe how I might be protected against misuse, or I might have some assumptions about what will happen as a result of consenting to donating my data or using a particular tool that will collect my data. But research, both my own and that of many other people, shows that people want more than this, right? We don't want to only kind of know what won't happen to our data, but we want to condition our consent on whether or not our data will be used well. And the example of this that I've been using lately is that in work that my group did on COVID-19 apps, one of the things that we found was that, experts, right, many of us as security and privacy experts, we'd spend a lot of time focusing on the privacy of these apps. We made privacy preserving algorithms, et cetera. And we sort of, in some way, there was sort of this assumption that people are going to adopt these contact tracing apps because they're private. But very few of us kind of ever adopt an application just because it's private, right? And so what we saw was that people had a lot of questions about like the accuracy of these apps. Well, how well are they going to detect exposures? How well are they going to protect other people? How well are they going to achieve this goal that you're telling me they're supposed to offer? And when we conduct some kind of quantitative studies to model people's decision-making around these contact tracing apps, what we see is that the role of privacy, as we would typically think about it with a data kind of consent model, was pretty much equal to the role of accuracy in people's thought process about whether or not to adopt. And so what they're consenting to isn't just kind of how you will or won't use their data in terms of like not doing something bad with it. It's also how you'll use it for good. And so they're expecting that you're going to do something beneficial with that data. And the same thing would probably be true if you were to think about, do I want to donate my data for medical research? When we look at those kind of cases, we see that people have a lot of questions about like, well, how long will it take to make a treatment? How likely is it? How much are you going to charge? How is that going to influence others? So it's kind of not just this sort of, oh, I'm consenting to just a particular privacy protection or a lack of misuse. People are looking for these actively beneficial components. And so my first provocation is to ask how we might reimagine consent, particularly in the space of data, but potentially in other spaces, to offer kind of positivity in addition to this sort of prevention angle that we often take. The second provocation that I'd like to make draws on kind of a different aspect of data privacy. So there's a theory in the space of data privacy, which is called contextual integrity. And the theory of contextual integrity kind of posits the idea that privacy is context relative. And what that means is that data that might feel appropriate to flow to one particular type of person in one particular context might feel entirely inappropriate if it suddenly went to a different person. So taking my medical example, one of the things we saw again with these COVID contact tracing apps in multiple countries was that people were, comfortable with those apps perhaps being deployed by a health department. It makes sense. Okay, I'm going to have health data with a health department for a health purpose. But all of a sudden, if you change who's deploying the app and therefore getting access to the data, their opinions about, whether or not they were comfortable using them were quite different. And so there's kind of this theory about this context relativity, and that goes sort of in opposition to other notions of privacy that focus on sort of ownership over data. And the connection I'd like to make is that in research that we've done with folks who create and share intimate images, for example, sex workers who might sell those images or use them for marketing, or folks who recreationally share those images, we find that for people who are sharing their images in contexts that people don't think about a lot, like they're sharing them in groups or they're sharing them for sale, others kind of struggle to understand that their consent is context relative. So just because I chose to sell my image on OnlyFans doesn't mean I consented to it appearing in like a WhatsApp chat group, right? It's very, very context relative. And the same, even if I'm sharing my image in a group, maybe it's validating to me of my identity or et cetera. I picked this particular, let's say, Reddit forum to share it in. That doesn't mean that I expect it to pop up in a totally different context. And so the second provocation is to think about how we could implement kind of context relative consent, especially for intimate contexts, because a lot of our current tools think very much in the binary. I am or I am not okay with this thing being out there, not I am okay with it in this context, I'm not okay with it in that context. And so I'd love to hear kind of what people think about these two provocations, if you have ideas, if you disagree with them, et cetera, and happy to discuss more.
Well, these are two excellent questions. I'll open it up to our other panelists first before I dig into both of these. Well, considering I'm seeing a lot of mutes on the microphones of our panelists, I'm going to offer up a couple thoughts. In terms of the context relevant consent, Alyssa, this is such a fantastic idea, but one that, as you're rightfully pointing out, is rather complicated in terms of how we can implement it. The part that I focus on with that is more of like a temporal context and how one's consent to how data is shared, whether it's a nude picture in an intimate context or in a more of a setting of donating data to a company to improve some kind of model, is how that decision might change over time, not just in the way one's personally feeling, but new information they're gathering from their partner. For example, someone chooses to share a physically revealing picture to a romantic partner, realizes a week or two later that person's actually married, and I don't want them to have access to that picture anymore. And so I think where I would go with that idea of implementing context relevant consent dips a little bit into what I've read from Jane with affirmative consent and this idea of making consent revocable at a later point in time. So not just simply deciding at a single cross-sectional point, these are the contexts in which I'm consenting to this data being used, but allowing me to change that decision at a later point.
Thanks for the comments. I really appreciate contextual integrity as well. It's something that I think it's a really important concept that's been useful for me too. I think, you know, I would love to see more contextual integrity in the design of socio-technical systems like social media platforms. You know, this is something that like I've suggested to social media platforms, like you should be able to, if you are tagged in a photo, or even if you just appear in a photo, you should be able to blur your face out or have your photo taken down. And those social media platforms say, absolutely not. That would create friction and that's not scalable. So if I'm understanding your provocation correctly, I think we're on the same side of this one, where I think that something like that would provide contextual integrity because it would give a person the ability to revoke their consent from a photo that maybe was taken in one context and then posted on Facebook in a different context. So I love the idea, but I guess my question back for the panel is like, how do we convince tech companies to add that kind of friction into it? Because I think like to do it right, that's where I landed is like, well, I should be able to take down my photo. Like if it's my face, I didn't want to be on that Facebook group. I didn't want to be on that thread. It doesn't matter that it was my parent or my partner who took the photo. No, like it's me. So I should have that right. But like, I don't. Anyway, so yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Amy. I mean, I think that's a great point about friction. And I was thinking it as I made the provocation, I was thinking of it as Doug, as you were speaking, right? Which is that anytime kind of we have to label these things, whether it's a context we're okay with or a context we're not okay with, like there are all of these sort of latent consent assumptions that we place there that maybe are uninterpretable either to other people or to platforms. And so I guess there's sort of a question of like, can we find a set of defaults that make sense, that like lower the burden sufficiently while still allowing for some context relativity, right? And that's something we've been thinking about a bit, is like, is there something you can encode in the content itself to say, okay, this is, you know, this is where I came from, this is where I meant to be as a piece of content, and oops, now I'm somewhere else. Is that a reasonable encoding? And I think that's sort of a flipped version, I think, of the blurring that you mentioned, or maybe it's kind of the same idea. And yeah, I think until we implement it, perhaps we don't know how burdensome people would or wouldn't find that, or if it needs to only be for certain kinds of content, et cetera.
We have a comment in the Q&A from Naomi Joyce Smith. Thank you so much for your participation. The question, I think this is tagging on to Amy's comment about getting these ideas implemented by tech companies. The comment is how to encourage funders to invest in the socio-technical platforms that are taking a consent-first approach in their design. I'll leave that there. Sorry.
I will try to answer that. I think this is sort of an open question, right, that's come up in the privacy context a lot, right? Often privacy folks or anti-privacy folks, whatever you might call it, will bring up kind of the privacy paradox, right? Where I think the answer we wish we could give is, well, people will vote with their feet and then the platforms will have to do the right thing and da, da, da. Okay, well, this doesn't work for a number of reasons that aren't really end users' fault for any particular reason, right? Which is that we need to use platforms for all kinds of different types of capital that we need access to, social and otherwise. And so we can't necessarily just vote with our feet. And often the flip side of that is that we say, okay, well, then we need legislation. Maybe that's more promising, although it is hard to kind of keep up with the times, but perhaps in something like consent, where there are higher level theoretical frameworks, that might be more promising. That said, I'm not a legislator or a lawyer, so I'll defer to if other panelists have thoughts on that.
I
Yeah,
guess,
go ahead.
I guess I just want to chime in and say that I think maybe this is too optimistic, but I think we're increasingly seeing a need for these safe, more consent approach-based platforms, especially for marginalized users. And so I think it's likely that we will, keep having Facebook and Twitter, but on the other hand, we do see an increasing need for these more safer spaces for, especially for marginalized populations. So I think maybe if the question is more like, how can we have both? So typical may be somewhat of a platform like Facebook and Twitter, but also at the same time, more options that marginalized populations can join and use safely.
We have a question from Jason Ortiz from Discord. Thank you, Jason. Within the context of an app, I imagine we could control context relevant consent, but I'm curious if it could ever be possible to do enough, since people can keep copies like screenshots that are now their own.
Yeah, this is something we've been thinking about quite a lot recently. So in the context of like child exploitation imagery, right? There's this database that different countries will run that have hashed versions of images. And basically the idea is that if there's a known piece of child exploitation imagery and you try to upload it and it's in this hash database, then a platform will be able to detect that and prevent it from being uploaded, right? And so this sort of routes around a bit the screenshot issue, although there are some issues with how people can modify the images, etc. Now, for adult content, there has been some push toward like a database system, but it's not as universal, right? And then also, of course, no matter, there are different kinds of features that you can try to do to create friction in taking screenshots, et cetera. You can always have another device. So I think this is an open kind of technical question of like, how do we ensure that you sort of have quote unquote permanent ownership over your content up until some threshold. I don't think it'll probably be plausible for us to make it entirely yours, but is there more that we can do? Probably. Does some of it require, computational research? Also probably. And some of it also has to do with like people's threat models, right? What are they willing to do up front versus is this always sort of a retroactive work to reclaim consent? And that's something that at least my group is looking into. And I'm curious if other people have had, have thoughts on whether we can do this across different applications.
We're going to have to continue these thoughts, because could you believe that it's already 15 minutes for our first provocation? And Alyssa, there was a follow-up comment on Discord for you from Jason. I encourage all of the panelists to engage with Discord either when they have a moment free during the panel or after the panel. That's going to stay there. We are going to now segue to Tomomi, who will offer up her own provocation and insight into the work that she's been doing.
Thank you, Doug. I'm going to share my screen now.
Sure.
Okay. Gotta be okay, good. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. I'm Tomomi Tanaka. I'm Director of International Safety at Match Group, and because I'm trained as a behavioral economist, so I will bring in behavioral perspectives on consent in this panel. First, I want to explain what Match Group is. Match Group is the owner of many leading dating apps such as Tinder, Match.com, Hinge, OkCupid, Plenty of Fish. And according to a survey, more than 50% of relationships which started on dating apps in the United States began on one of the Match Group apps. So we are the largest dating apps in not only in the world, in the United States, but also in the world, as we have major dating apps in France like Meetic and Japan Pairs. So we do own quite a few dating apps outside of the US as well. So in this panel, I will focus more on consent education programs of Match Group. And because our research has shown that when our users have more awareness and education on consent, they are more likely to engage in safe practices in real life. So Match Group's apps have carried out various consent campaigns in the past. And I'm going to highlight Tinder India's campaign, new consent campaign called We Need to Talk, because it has been particularly very successful. Its YouTube video gained over 1.6 million views in just 2 months. And last year, they produced 2 other films, YouTube videos, and both of them gained over 1 million views as well. And they're using this video to run a consent workshop at colleges, universities, and bringing content expert. And also, we have we are launching self-paced free online learning module on understanding consent. So I want to discuss why I want to share my view on why Tinder India's consent campaign has been so successful from behavioral science perspectives in 4 points. Oh, it says 1, 1, 1, 1, but it's supposed to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and the first point is that Tinder India actually conducted research to understand why people do what they do or why they don't gain consent. According to their own research, 65% of Indian young adults did not know how to give and ask for consent. More than 50% of them didn't know what to do if their consent is violated. And in addition, we know that we need to take into account that behavioral science research results have shown many people are even unaware of their own actions, like they are not asking for consent, they are not gaining consent. And this largely explains why people don't ask or give consent, or they don't even consider consent. And that is the foundation of their campaign, that consent is not well practiced among our users. And the second, Tinder India used storytelling and videos to increase user engagement and promote consent. They created relatable and persuasive story. Behavioral science research has shown that storytelling enhances comprehension and memory. So storytelling is an effective method. And because of that, they use storytelling using YouTube videos. And their own research, Tinder India's research, has shown that 8 in 10 Indian young people have either personally experienced or know somebody who has experienced something uncomfortable while dating. So many people, they build a story that many people can relate to. And when people see someone doing something, their brain reacts as if they are taking that action themselves. So the effect is stronger when the situation is familiar to them. So the key to the success is that they created videos which are very familiar to many young adults. And the third point is, it is important to create emotional connections and trigger emotional satisfaction and social approval. So Tinder's videos acknowledge fears, struggle, and confusion around consent, and show viewers how good they will feel if they are accepted, not only by their own partners, but also by peers and the community. And the fourth point is that it is important to invent role models. If there is no role model, people don't know what to do. and create the image that consent is cool and sexy. And that was very successfully done by Tinder India team. People who are uncertain about what to do with, will imitate people whom they like and feel. So they have feel connection to, they actually picked actors who are not necessarily popular, but the people whom they think that are going to be likable and the people can feel connected to. And the video shows people who are shows people what are the right things to do when they are in the relationship. And Tinder India's video was very successful at cueing people on how they should behave in these situations. Okay, so Match Group brands have carried out consent campaigns. Like OkCupid had a major campaign, Plenty of Fish had another major campaign, and Tinder also had a successful consent campaign in Japan as well. So this is the lesson we learned. There's a cultural difference in attitudes and social norms. So the Tinder India campaign has been very successful. However, it doesn't mean that it will be successful in other countries or for other brands which have different user base. Conceptualization of consent should take into account that cultural difference in attitude and social norms do exist. For example, Tinder India's consent campaign emphasized the need of consent for kissing. They are not even starting with a conversation on sex, but kissing, touching, they really need to be more considerate. They need to gain consent. So this might not be the case in other cultures, but Tinder India thought that it was very important to start from kissing. And culturally diverse understanding of consent can improve the way we design and research computer-mediated content. So we really need to understand our users and their cultures to improve the way we design and communicate, but also it has to be well backed by research, good research. That is my last conclusion, is that collaboration between academia and industry is very important. And the right-hand side of the slide, I show the relationship between the percentage of young men who think that wife beating can be justified, and then the percentage of women who experienced young adults experienced intimate partner violence. And the highest, I think it was Papua New Guinea, that over 70% of men think that it's okay to wife beating is justified, or violence against women is justified. And that is also where, a lot of women, experience violence. And okay, consent is not the same as the violence, but, consent education is very important, not just for dating and, under educational purpose, but really changing the society and changing people's behavior. Okay. That's any question?
Oh, there is a question in the chat, as a matter of fact, on Discord from Haesu Kim. Thank you so much for your participation. The question, I'm wondering how much we work around bad actors. Awareness campaigns or nudges can help people who don't know how to approach consent, but it doesn't stop people from intentionally violating other people's consent, which can even be caused by backlash to such campaigns. Do you have any reactions to that?
Yes, we do have quite a few tools already installed on Tinder, especially, and Hinge and OkCupid and Plenty of Fish. For example, Are You Sure function, I don't know if you are familiar with it in Tinder. Before you send a message, Tinder app will ask you, are you sure you want to send this message, right? So this kind of stops people from sending aggressive messages, right? And then we also have the function like, did it make you feel uncomfortable? So the app will ask you if the message you have received made you uncomfortable. And that is kind of, encouraging people to speak up. So we do have quite a few features in the app that would, make people aware of what they are doing. And it has to be done at the time that they are making comment, sending messages to others. And that is very important that we do it instantly. And that is, of course, that requires our AIs, AI based moderations. Otherwise, because we cannot really catch it instantly. So AI is well developed for that type of, features.
Awesome. I think we have another message coming in from Isha on Discord. I'll let her type the rest of that out while that's happening. I wanted to just briefly ask, you had mentioned the idea of collaboration between academia and industry. And I think to those of us on the academic side, that sounds amazing. And what I'm very curious about is how you envision that playing out. Because I think the stereotypical view is the academic takes the data from the industry partner, creates some kind of discovery and then publishes, and maybe it damages the reputation of the company that offered the data. How do you envision collaboration happening between academia and maybe even your own company at Match Group?
I think it's quite difficult. I come from academia and moved into the the World Bank and then the private sector. And I both in the World Bank and private sector, I find very difficult to publish work, research. And we do a lot of research within the company, but doesn't mean that we include researchers in that. So I think the discussion is like, how do we first agree with, the collaboration, the form of collaboration. Like there are professors, the academia that have been doing research with corporate, and that is possible. But I think first we need to really well agree with the scope of collaboration, but it is possible. And, I don't think we should shy away from that.
Thank you.
Is there any particular example where you thought that was a very successful collaboration between academia and Tinder or other apps that comes to your mind?
I don't know about the dating apps, be honest with you. And the good collaboration between academia and dating apps. And I'm sure Doug knows it very well, that he has been doing a lot of research with the users of dating apps. But I don't really know if there's anyone who has really participated in our research. So that is something that I don't know, but there are many other examples that, for example, I'm really close friend with Professor John List at University of Chicago, who has done a lot of research with companies. Like, he was a chief economist at Uber, published many papers on Uber's, pricing system and many other, new features. And he moved to Lyft, and he's now with Walmart. And he has been publishing many academic papers from top journals, being a chief economist of this company. So his strategy has been really moving into the private sector as an advisor or chief economist and, conduct research from inside. But I'm sure it can be done from outside as well. So that is a challenge. And that's a new challenge for us, but it can be done, I'm sure.
Can I chime in real quick? This is really great, Tomomi. I was thinking when you were talking about the campaigns to kind of change the culture around consent, as someone who comes from more of a research ethics background, I feel like there's a kind of long history in academic research of marginalized communities having very good reason not to trust academics when it comes to research data collection. For example, like in the United States, Black and Indigenous communities with misuse of genetic samples and things like that. And so I was just curious, I feel like it just kind of prompted me to think about both kind of changing the culture in academia around kind of like treating research participants with care, and also maybe like kind of that broader idea of like the kind of norms and the culture and the things that kind of just go beyond like individual actions when it comes to consent. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, it's not academia, but Match Group at least has been very closely working with LGBTQ communities and NGOs. So we have tons of collaborations with these organizations to promote, LGBTQ right, and also mitigating discrimination on the platforms. However, it wasn't involving academia. It's more of a collaboration between corporate and NGOs. That is more of how we have been approaching this issue.
We are at time on Tomomi's provocation. Time goes so fast in these discussions. Next up, thank you so much, Tomomi. Next up is going to be Amy. If you would care to share your slides. Yeah, great.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of the panelists, and thank you so much to the organizers for organizing this, and of course to all the participants for all the questions and activity in the chat. This is fascinating, and it's great to be part of this conversation. So in my previous work on sexting, I found consent to be a pretty useful concept. The way I used it in this work was what I saw as solving a problem, which was that in law and in education, people were not distinguishing between consensual sexting and image-based sexual abuse. And of course, consent is the key difference there. One of them is a sex act, the other one is an act of abuse and privacy violation. So this was an important and sort of useful concept for my work there, and I think it still is. A couple of years after this book, you can tell from the shape of the iPhones, this book is 2015. So a couple of years after that, I lived in Germany for a year on a sabbatical fellowship. And it was at the time GDPR was still relatively new. And I was confronted constantly with consent for cookie pop-ups. And here's an example. This is a screenshot of a cookie consent pop-up. It says, "We use cookies on this site to enhance user experience. And our two options are, I've read it, or more information." So of course you have to lie to access this website, because I did not read it, you did not read it, no one except the lawyers who wrote it have read this. We know all this, this is well established in research actually. And so part of this, and thinking about this in terms of consent, has led me to a new project that I'm working on now with Dylan Mulvin, who's at LSE. And what we're interested in is how ideas about consent work, what they do, and how those ideas move between data and sex, discourses about data, discourses about sex. And in that project, we're drawing on queer and feminist theories, as well as technology and data studies, but we'll focus on the latter just for this discussion. So of course, many scholars have identified problems with consent in the context of data. This is Nissenbaum, who talks about the transparency paradox. Of course, when we consent to data privacy policies, we are not really informed. We're definitely not consenting in any way that's specific. She calls this the transparency paradox, that if a privacy policy is detailed and specific, we're not going to understand it, let alone even read it. A second problem with consent is that imbalances of power can, of course, invalidate consent. And here, Sonia Livingston is very useful, where she talks about children. That's an obvious example. We have special rules for children, but what's fascinating about those special rules for children is that it creates this problematic, quote, problematic normative vision of all other users as somehow invulnerable and invincible. So because we've cordoned off children, we're assuming that the rest of us adults can unproblematically and uncomplicatedly consent to things that we don't really even understand. And a third problem with consent is that it can be coerced even when it really seems like it's freely given. So here's another screenshot of a consent pop-up. Are you happy to accept cookies? No, I am not. But my only choices are accept all or manage. There is no option to refuse, right? This is obvious, but there's no choice to refuse. The only choice is to not use the website. And if it's a frivolous website that's for entertainment, maybe that's fine. If it's a government or bank website, that's obviously a lot more serious because I don't really have the choice to refuse. And so these discourses of consent tend to put us in this position of imagining that we have control and choice. Here's two more screenshots of some cookie consents. The headlines on each are "You're in control" and "It's your choice." So this is the promise that we are controlling it. But of course, choosing between the options that are on offer here is really not doing that much to reduce harm. So a fourth problem with consent is that it places the responsibility for what are really systemic and structural problems on individuals and our choices, our agency, our exercise of control. And so I really like Eleanor Carmy's critique of this, where she says, portrayed as control, autonomy, and power, consent actually removes responsibility from service or technology providers to individual users. And what she ultimately argues is that consent is a design fail that should not be engineered into our online lives anymore. So given all of those limitations and issues, well, the question that I want to ask is, how could we design the internet and data protection policies without the need for consent at all? How could we design for people who can't consent, not just children, but thinking about all of the ways that we can't actually meaningfully consent? And what would the internet look like if it was safe enough that we didn't have to wave away all of our rights by constantly consenting to what are essentially unknowable risks every time we accept a privacy policy? Thank you.
What a provocation.
I was asked to be provocative, so I did my best.
I'll open it up to the panelists or to the audience. Jason says, great stuff, Amy. I don't know if a question is coming, but I'll keep my eye out. Jonathan says, this rules. Yes, I agree.
Oh, I crashed someone's computer. That's what I want to hear. I don't know, you invited me to the consent panel and you said, be provocative. So here I am.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to go first, Doug?
No.
So yeah, this is really great, Amy. Thank you. It kind of reminds me about the, I guess, collective action angle. So I think, yeah, in the usable privacy space, I think a lot of researchers are agreeing that when it comes to privacy consent interfaces, we lack a lot of usability. It's really useless. And so I think one direction, I think it's still necessary to think about how to redesign these interfaces to make it unburdensome as possible. But I think also there's another important direction, more about, I guess, collective action. So I think you made a really great point that there are some people who cannot, explicitly and validly consent. So it becomes really important for, I guess, people to engage in discourse with one another. Like, what's the best way? What's really, what are some decisions that we should make as a society that could impact a lot of people at once? And so I think these kind of collective discourse and also collective resistance becomes really important. Yeah, I think maybe Jonathan, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, I think Jonathan might have more to say about this, but yeah, thank you.
Should I respond to that or wait?
Yeah,
sure,
yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was, I missed something. I also wanted to, so like, yes, of course, collective action, definitely, extremely, like, that's where we need to be going. I think, like, I agree if that's what you're suggesting. I also noticed a question that I wanted to draw on from Jason in the chat that asks, like, if laws would help reduce this need. And the way that I've been thinking about this lately is that most consumer products we don't consent to use them, right? Like we buy a toy for our children and there's no like consent form that we sign, right? We just live in countries mostly where there are government agencies that have laws. There's a system of liability, there's a system of regulation. They don't work perfectly by any means, but they're there. And so if I buy a child a toy, I have a reasonable expectation that that toy will not hurt that child. And so there's no like layer of consent that exists that's like, oh, just consent to using a dangerous toy and then give the toy to your child. Like that's not how we do most consumer products, but that is how we do the internet. And so to put it back to collective action, where I think the answer, part of the answer might be, is that these are policy changes where like, and that's something that has to come from democratic collective action in various forms to actually make changes. I mean, there's fascinating history that maybe some of you are aware of that like in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration is not that old, right? I think it's maybe more than a century, but not much more than a century old. And before it existed, before there was food regulations, stuff like flour would be like flour that you cook with would routinely be full of like wallpaper paste or plaster or whatever, because it was cheaper. And then of course people were mad about this. They were like, why are my rolls not, tasty? Why do they taste like plaster? Because there's no regulation and because we don't have time to check like everyone's flour. This feels like a tangent, but I promise it's relevant because we have like regulations now about, and people were mad about it and organized collectively and demanded like, we want to be able to buy flour from the store that contains only flour, and that required collective action. So I feel like that answer is that's my answer to both questions, is that like to do this, to make that internet one that is safe for everyone, it has to be policy, because I don't think that the private companies, their responsibilities to shareholders, as we sort of talked about in the first discussion, like if the responsibility is only to shareholders, it doesn't look good for justice or reducing harm or really dealing with these issues.
I could follow
There's
up on
a-
that.
Sorry, Jonathan. I was just going to call out one of the clever comments from Naomi on Discord. You can't go live until a humor committee has verified there's a fun process to learn your data rights. Go ahead, Jonathan.
All right. Thank you so much, Amy. I feel like I really enjoyed the part of your presentation where you're talking about how consent is kind of promised to us as this thing that offers autonomy and power. And I think something that I really enjoy about your work is that it like challenges us to think about autonomy as kind of a more expansive thing than just like an individual concern. I think like in Sexting Panic, you point out like photos sometimes have more than one person in them. And that's just like not something that individual notions of autonomy and consent are equipped to think about. And I think this goes back to the conversation with Alyssa's provocation too, with like once you send something out into the world, like it's kind of the sphere of influence has kind of exceeded the bounds of like an individual autonomous unit. So I'm just curious to hear you talk more about like how you're thinking about autonomy as like embedded in these relationships and in contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that comment. For like my entire research career, I've been fascinated with how we think about agency and how we think about other people's agency in particular. And that definitely came up in my work on sexting, because especially when we talk about young people, there's always this idea that like young people cannot consent, they cannot have agency. If people are doing something we don't like, we tend to say, well, they don't have agency, they don't know what they're doing. Especially when it's young people, it's very easy. When it's racialized people, when it's queer people, it's very easy for those who are in more privileged social categories to say, well, they don't have agency. Like they don't know what they're doing. They're just being manipulated by someone else. They're being manipulated by media. They're being like forced to do this because they just, they think it will get them attention or whatever. It's like as if we don't all want to get attention from our partners and prospective partners. Like, come on, that's how it works. It's dating, right? So this issue of autonomy is like, my interest in it is always like the way it's being imagined and constructed. And I think that's precisely the problem that I'm having with consent, both in data and in sex and the discourses about sex ed, is that it imagines us all as like sort of liberal, autonomous individuals who have this innate capacity to like assess the situation, make a rational choice, and make the right choice for ourselves in every moment at all times. And then we have that as the norm. And then we cordon off all these other groups like, oh, people who are children, people sometimes who are over a certain age, people who have certain disabilities. We like separate them out and say, no, those people can't actually consent. But then we imagine that the rest of us can. And when we really think about it, I think you have to question like, how much agency do I really have? Because it's always going to be between people. It's always going to be intersubjective, right? Like even how I think about myself, what I want to do, it's always in relation to other people. So what does that even mean to say that I have individual agency? I'm not trying to go down a black hole of like, no one has free will. But I think it is really interesting politically when we then hinge everything on consent, because that just implies in sex and in data that like we are these powerful individuals who have the ability to make all these choices. The problem with that is then when things go wrong, it's our fault because we made the wrong choice, right? We didn't cover our drink at the bar. We walked home alone by ourselves. We went up to the person's house after the date. We didn't choose the right cookies. We didn't choose the right privacy settings, et cetera, et cetera. These are not the same, but the parallels are so interesting to me, the way that then we blame people when things go wrong because we've set them up as like perfect individual autonomous agents, and then things go wrong and it's like, well, you made the wrong choices, because all that you have is individual choices. And back to Jane's initial question, this has to be a collective issue. This has to be systemic. This has to be structural. We can't, oh, it's 1 more minute. Okay, we'll stop there. Thank you all for your comments. This has been lovely. Thanks for letting me know my time is up.
I love that conversation. And I just want to say, I agree with a lot of your criticisms of models of sexual consent, not only within that very context, but applied or projected to other situations. We'll continue on to either Jane or Jonathan, whoever would prefer to go next would be fine with me.
I'm fine with either. Yeah, Jonathan, maybe do you want to go first because you haven't, like I already kind of spoke in the introduction.
Sure, I'm happy to go. Right. Okay. Did I do this correctly? And you are looking at my slides and not my presenter notes. Okay.
Yep.
Great. Cool. So hi, I'm Jonathan. I'm just gonna quickly like introduce some of my research to kind of set the stage for my provocation. So as many people probably know, in 2014, there was a study between Cornell and Facebook that altered the contents of hundreds of thousands of Facebook news feeds to study whether being exposed to more positive or negative emotional content had an effect on what people would then post in terms of their own emotional state. And when the public found out about this study, they were surprised and upset. Many people asked questions like, this study was legal, but was it actually ethical? And an important perspective that came out in this conversation critiquing Facebook was about the lack of informedness. So Facebook users, after the study was over, still had not been informed that they were part of the study. And this is an idea about individual autonomy, because the concern here is that users didn't have a choice to control their involvement in the study because they didn't know they were part of the study. And so to kind of think about this question of like the normative power of like informing and giving people a chance to opt out, my collaborator Nathan Matthias and I designed this system called Bartleby. And the idea was to use software to automate the process of debriefing for a study like this. So debriefing is a research ethics procedure that happens at the end of a study after data collection. And the process goes, you notify participants that they were involved in research. So we sent people a link to a website where they could kind of see the details of some research that we had done. We told the participants what data was collected on them and why. So there was explicitly a data table of all of the data that we had collected. And importantly, we provided them an opportunity to opt out. So by checking this box on the website, they were asking us to delete their data. And when we were evaluating this system, we were kind of thinking about different ways to think about whether or not it was successful from a kind of normative standpoint. On the one hand, it gave people access to choices that they otherwise wouldn't have had. So some people were able to successfully use the interface to opt out of the study and delete their data. If we hadn't, used the software, they probably still would have wanted to, but wouldn't have been able to. On the other hand, we were able to kind of create opportunities to have more like broader value-driven conversations, but we couldn't kind of automatically solve any of these issues, right? So a lot of the people, even if they didn't use our system to opt out, ended up contacting us with various kind of either political or moral concerns about their involvement in the study. They wanted to know what we would use the data for after the fact. They wanted to know why they were included in the study, even if they had been banned by the subreddit, a few months ago, et cetera. And so while we were kind of able to understand more like what different kind of value-driven concerns were at play, software obviously cannot kind of address all these different very contextual things. So you can read more about this in the full paper, where we also talk about applying different theories from feminist philosophy on autonomy to thinking about the different ways that software like can and can't do moral work in these situations. But I kind of want to use that as the backdrop to set up my provocation, which is, what if we thought about consent as just one tool in the autonomy toolkit? And what do I mean by that? So when we think about consent, I mean, this has come up in some of the previous panelists' provocations, but informed consent is a procedure designed specifically to uphold this moral principle of individual autonomy. And in particular, consent has these strict preconditions. So we need things like prior informedness, lack of coercion, et cetera, for us to think that the consent is meaningful. In Jane's work and in many others, we reference this Fry's model, freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, and specific. And we need all these things to be true for consent to be doing the work that we want it to do. Unfortunately, often these conditions just aren't met in the real world, yet we're using consent anyway. And maybe this, kind of is in conversation with what Amy is saying about consent. So I just want to kind of point to a few of the things that people in different fields, from the empirical social sciences to like bioethics, have been thinking about to address some of these moral gray areas. So one of them is debriefing, kind of like in the project that I was talking about. We use debriefing or retroactive consent when upfront informed consent is not possible. So for example, if you're studying political speech on Twitter during an election, you don't know beforehand who's going to log on that day. Also, asking everyone to opt into data collection might influence, what they're willing to talk about. However, you still kind of want to do this research for public interest reasons. Debriefing is not really equivalent to what we want out of informed consent. It's definitely not revertible. If you intervene in these conversations, you can't undo that if someone wants to opt out later. Another example is proxy consent. So proxy consent is something that is used for large groups of people who are within an existing governance structure. And as an example, if you're studying communities on Reddit, you might, rather than individually asking each member of a subreddit for consent, you might ask the moderators, because there's some idea that power has already been delegated to those moderators to make decisions on behalf of the community. And you would want to do this because if you do some sort of intervention in a Reddit community, it'll affect everyone who is in that community, whether or not that individual necessarily consents or not. So maybe moderators are positioned to kind of help facilitate those decisions on people's behalf. The trade-off here, of course, is that communities are heterogeneous. Not everyone will see these decisions made on their behalf as legitimate. And then finally, the idea of hypothetical consent. So this is used when subjects can't communicate an active decision. So the example here is if there's a patient that's rolled into the hospital and they're unconscious. The patient can't consent to treatment, but perhaps they would if they were conscious. But then maybe you look into their medical records and they have religious reasons that they would hypothetically refuse certain treatments, and then you kind of update your hypothetical understanding of their values. At the same time, you're kind of weighing this, as a doctor against your maybe normative value that you should be saving lives when you can. And the trade-off here is that you just have to make assumptions, and this is, arguably a pale substitute for actual consent. And so just kind of thinking about all these different approaches to these really kind of imperfect situations, like I'm not saying we should be kind of actively seeking to replace our uses of consent with all of these things, but I think it's worth kind of interrogating like where the limitations of like where are we asking consent to do normative work that it's not capable of doing. And in particular, I think something I want to put out there is just that I think we need frameworks for thinking systematically about how these approaches come to be, and especially how people at the margins resist systems of data power. And I'm kind of working on some new work with my collaborators at Cat Lab, kind of thinking through the different like dimensions or considerations of how people might think about data reviews. And these are kind of things that have come up earlier in the conversation. So like thinking about autonomy as something that's individual or relational or collective, thinking about time, and whether certain things are reversible or not, whether the actions people take to like opt out or opt in actually have the power to meaningfully change what powerful actors are doing, and what are the costs to maybe opting out. And with that, let's open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Panelist, audience, before I speak, I'll allow others to jump in before me.
Thanks, Jonathan. I thought that proxy consent point was really interesting. This is something I've been hearing from health folks a lot as well, where they're sort of saying, okay, I might have a particular medical condition and I'm sort of part of a group around that medical condition, and I would like for, the Foundation for X to sort of advocate on my behalf, right? And I'm curious, as you're thinking about proxy consent, kind of, are we imagining that the proxies will have sort of special training, or just that they're folks who have the time and bandwidth to like deal with this? This is not to say that you have the answer, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot, is like, is this a role that you're trained for? Is it just like moderators in social communities? I'm curious if you thought about that at all.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think what's interesting about proxy consent is it kind of starts to think about that like individual versus collective action thing, where we're kind of starting to shift, the responsibility for individuals to kind of manage all of their relationships with like different data brokers onto maybe a proxy that can act on the behalf of like many people. I'm not really sure what this ideally looks like in practice. I know that a lot of like law people have been thinking about the idea of like like fiduciary responsibility or like some sort of responsibility to act like in the best interests of people that they represent, as kind of a core feature of something we'd want for something like this. I'm not a lawyer by any means, so I don't really know kind of how to say more about that conversation, but I do think it's important to figure out, especially in medical settings. Yeah, thank you.
Other comments? Alyssa worded my question way better than I could. I was also similarly interested in this idea of proxy consent and who is assuming responsibility, going back to Amy's provocation, who is assuming responsibility for these decisions, especially when things go wrong or contrary to the health or the well-being of individual users who were not involved in that consent process. We're actually right on time. Anyway, any closing thoughts from anyone? We are at the final 15 minutes. Look how fast this has gone, everybody. We've done an hour and 15 minutes already. Jane, I'll let you close this out for today with your provocation.
Are you sure? Like, I can end mine really quick.
Your work is so fascinating. Jane, we need your provocation. Go ahead, please.
Okay, but feel free to cut me off if you know.
I will never do that. I do not consent to doing that, but go ahead.
Okay, I'll try to make it within 5 minutes. So hi everyone. I'm broadly interested in using consent, especially feminist perspective on consent, as a lens for system design research to tackle integrity issues on social media. So I'm interested in issues like online harassment and surveillance and data ownership problems. Let's see. Oh, so I'll briefly introduce a paper that showcases this. My collaborators, which included Yuna Lee, who coined the terminology consentful technologies. We wrote a KAI 2021 paper, which should introduce affirmative consent principles to social platform design. So we started writing this paper in 2019, and we thought it's really important to bring discourse around feminist perspectives on consent to social platform design, because many problems with social media are deeply related to the fact that platforms were built without thinking about users, especially marginalized people's consent. And so so we were particularly interested in affirmative consent. So in the context of United States, affirmative consent was an important feminist movement to prevent sexual assaults. And in a sense, it means that someone must ask for and earn enthusiastic approval before interacting with another person. So first in the paper, what we did was we, by deriving from literature in feminist studies, HCI, and legal scholarship, we define affirmative consent as voluntary, informed, revertible, specific, and unburdensome. And so, for instance, affirmative consent is specific, which means people should be able to consent to a particular action or particular person and not a series of actions or people. Affirmative consent is, I forgot a slide, but also unburdensome, which means that costs associated with the giving consent shouldn't be so high that a person gives in and says yes when they would rather say no. So this is the last point. But I think when writing this paper, what interested me the most was showing that affirmative consent is a generative lens for coming up with concrete software design ideas. That is, it helps us answer the question, if we build a new social platform grounded in consent, what would that look like? So what we did was we conducted a design exercise where we applied the 5 principles of affirmative consent to 7 common features of social platforms, such as messaging, profile pages, etc. So we asked what would an voluntary messaging look like? What would an informed messaging look like? Until we came up with about 35 design ideas. And I'm going to give one due to time, I'm going to give one example, applying the specific principle to platform profiles. So currently on many social media platforms, either our profile is public or private, there's nothing in between. And this is problematic because users have a desire to express that oneself online, but they're there's also a group of users who want to minimize privacy risks because profile pages can reveal a lot about a person. Applying a specific principle to profile pages means the platform lets users customize certain profile information visibility to certain groups of accounts. And interestingly, last year, KakaoTalk, a very popular messenger platform in South Korea, where I'm from, implemented something similar. And I have nothing to do with this feature, but I thought it's still very interesting, so I would like to introduce it today. So they implemented something called a multi-profile feature, which lets each account on the platform make multiple profiles and customize each profile image and background to a certain network of friends. So this is actually a screenshot of my KakaoTalk account. And this is a profile that's displayed to a very close group of friends, I would say less 15. In contrast, this is an example of a profile that's shown to, I would say, I guess, people who are in my friend list, but I don't consider them very close. So you can see that I customize the image, status message, and also music. So it's important to consider the regional context here. It kind of ties to what Tomomi mentioned. So KakaoTalk is a really widely used messenger platform in South Korea. So it's not only used for friends and intimate partners, it's also used in workplace settings. So what that means is Koreans were increasingly feeling difficulties in maintaining their privacy, especially at work. So this feature lets people safely express themselves to people who they feel comfortable with, while also preventing privacy risks. I thought this is an interesting example that shows that there's a lot of room left to explore new designs for social media by centering users' consent boundaries. And so back to my own research, I'm continuously interested in designing and building interfaces and systems grounded in affirmative consent. So some directions I'm interested in is actually building a small scale platform for testing the design ideas introduced in the paper, especially by considering power dynamics, which I think kind of ties to what Jonathan was mentioning. And another direction is actually redesigning advertisement settings on social media. So my provocation is based on this fact that my research is in this intersection between understanding consent, but also designing and building new interfaces based on consent. So my provocations are, finally, what are some research topics and applications that would benefit the most from researchers designing and building systems that center users' affirmative consent? And what are some struggles the panelists or audience have faced when doing systems building work for research on consent? And how can CSW as a community perhaps alleviate some of these challenges if possible? And with that, yeah, I guess if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you, Jane. There's some comment from Naomi in Discord about a similar protocol design, multiple profiles for different contexts that has been researched, and there's a link there to look at another time. I do have a question. In light of what we've heard from other panelists, particularly with Amy and with Jonathan, with limitations to consent, and also with Alyssa, I'm going to your provocation of some research topics and applications. I'm curious about applying a critical lens to affirmative consent as a model to use as a foundation for social platform design, given I know you're well aware of some of the criticisms that have been directed towards it in a sexual context. Could you talk through a little bit of why you find that model to be the most appropriate one to build social platforms with, and maybe how to contend with some of the criticisms that anticipated users of these platforms themselves might have?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a thread that I've been like really thinking about after writing this paper. So to give a bit of a context, at the time there were, I guess, in 2019 when we started writing this paper, I would say there were less papers explicitly discussing consent within the CHI and CSW community. So we thought it's really important that we were well aware of the limitations of affirmative consent, but we thought it's a good start to kind of spark the discussion that this is a very ideal form of consent, and it's still necessary to kind of have this discourse around this is what an ideal consent will look like without situations like power dynamics. But so I think it kind of serves as like a really good, I guess, design spec to think of as a something that's ideal for users, especially with marginalized populations. So I think I definitely received this kind of critique after writing this paper, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that we were really thinking about marginalized users' consent when writing this paper. So for many, I guess many users, they probably don't have these struggles online, but for marginalized users like women of color, kind of having this space where one can freely express oneself is very important. And we thought the affirmative consent was a really good argument was a good model of consent to make that argument, that this is what marginalized populations would really want if they had this online space to themselves. But I think going forward, I've been definitely thinking a lot about the limitations of affirmative consent. And that's why I've been thinking about, I guess, especially power dynamics within social media. For instance, I think PhD students and one's advisor is a really important, interesting example where we use, for instance, messaging systems to communicate with our advisors, but there's definitely this power dynamics at play. So I think in my work, I'm starting to think about these, I guess, concrete scenarios where power dynamics exist. And when it's very hard for a person to express their affirmative consent, like how can we design interfaces for those kind of scenarios?
Yeah, I see where you're going for sure. We have a comment from Jason on Discord. As an XR researcher, I obviously think of social VR apps. VR avatar embodiment and consent is very much at play because of the realness of feeling like people are invading your physical space via proximity, gestures, and audio on top of chat, of course. Now, I don't see a question embedded there, but a question that comes to my mind from reading Jason's comment, because I'm also doing some work in that space as well, is the challenges or possibilities that are opened up by considering emerging technologies, XR, maybe social robotics, for affirmative consent or other models of consent. Because my understanding, Jane, with your work is it's predominantly mobile social platform design. And I'm curious what you see as future directions for applying affirmative consent to some of these other technologies like XR that Jason brings up.
Yeah, totally. I'm definitely not the expert on this, but I think one example that comes to mind is the types of data and information. So I think with XR apps, I think we have a designer and a developer would need to think more critically about that there's so many types of data that can be collected when a user uses an XR app. Like, for instance, when a user is walking down the street with the XR app and another, I guess, a bystander passes by, that it's also possible for the app to collect information about the bystander as well. So I think it becomes more difficult to kind of also think about there's more types of data that can be involved, and also, I guess, more higher degrees of freedom when it comes to interactions as well. I'm not so sure if that answered the question, but.
Sounds good to me. Any closing questions from the panelists? We're getting some excellent suggestions from Naomi for podcasts related to XR ethics. I think that's going to be work on consent with XR. I'm going to have to give those a listen. I will close out with one other question for the panelists that comes to my mind from looking at Jane's presentation in regards to, Jane, you're using the word testing, these prototypical affirmative consent platform designs. I'm broadly curious about involving users in the design of consentful technology because of just this significant variety and diversity and disagreement regarding how consent is supposed to be exchanged, whether it's to sex, whether it's to data or anything else. How we can contend for those differences, those conflicts that are almost certain to arise when involving users and other stakeholders into the design process.
So your question is about how do we better, I guess, involve stakeholders in this design process?
Yeah, like this goes into my provocation, which is why I really didn't need to go over my slides. Is, you know, if you involve stakeholders, let's say some of the marginalized users, and they go, I find affirmative, what are some of the typical criticisms? I find it too cumbersome. I find it too awkward. And they resist. How do we contend with that if those are the stakeholders we're trying to design for?
That's a really good question. I'm not so sure, maybe I'm kind of branching off too far from your question, but I think ultimately it would be really interesting to also explore interfaces that kind of let users, I guess, give feedback to the community moderators or the owners of the space, or potentially even, I guess, modifying the interfaces themselves if they find any interfaces that they find burdensome, or I guess one good example would be maybe disabled users, they find that this interface doesn't really fit their needs, then potentially thinking about giving good feedback to either to the, I guess, community moderators, potentially even configuring the interfaces themselves.
Yeah, like a modular interface design.
Mhm,
That'd be cool.
mhm.
Everyone, could you believe it? We're 90 minutes in. We did it. Congratulations, panelists, on a very engaging conversation. To our audience, thank you so much for your involvement in the chat. Isha, thank you for correcting me, 89 minutes. Of course, those messages, those reading suggestions, I'll shamelessly put in one of my own on the Discord, will remain there, at least for the duration of this conference, from what I understand. I welcome you to peruse those suggestions and to reach out to us panel organizers if anything comes to mind. Everyone have a great evening or afternoon or morning. I'll be signing off now.
Thank you.
Thank you.